Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Tell Me More About podcast. I'm in a little bit of a different role today because I'm not the one answering questions. I'm going to be the one asking them because I got my dad with me today who preached this weekend. So if you're not familiar how the podcast works, basically what we do is we go into a little bit more depth on whatever we talked about this weekend at Church on the Move. And this weekend was my dad, and we're in week 3 of Joseph, Dad, and you had chapters, 40 and 41?
Yeah, supposed to do 40 and 41. I couldn't help but go back to 37, 39 a little bit.
I loved it. So I was in Chicago this week because I had a graduated from Wheaton, which is the end of
Congratulations.
Thank you. End of a big journey for me, and so you got to watch my graduation on live stream, and I got to watch your preaching on live stream this week. I didn't hear the entirety of the message yet because of all the travel and all that stuff, but the stuff that I did hear, in fact, probably the chunk of the sermon I heard, I was so thrilled about. I was texting Francis, my oldest son, just to say, I hope you're listening to this, because that the law of the hand stuff, and particularly, and I can't wait to get into this, some stuff you talked about, desperation, that I thought was so good, because man, there's so much to learn here from a leadership, maybe parent perspective, anywhere where you're, trying to navigate life, honestly, like adulthood. This is huge. The stuff about being in the dark was amazing. That was really cool. So I can't wait to jump into all of that. So maybe I'll just start here. For anybody that maybe hasn't heard it yet, describe the law of the hand. What do you mean by that? That's an interesting phrase.
Well, the scriptures have a lot to say about diligence. And Proverbs is loaded with that. And Proverbs is a success book. Yeah. And it's God's wisdom to do well in life. Deals with all kinds of things. It's not just your money and your financial success, but it's about your marriage. It's about raising your kids. It's about everything. But it deals a lot with diligence, which you cannot separate from your physical work, and that's what it is. And so the scripture says, the hand of the diligent shall bear rule. And I noticed that when diligence is spoken of in Proverbs, it's always linked to the hand. Well, I've always been a big fan of Joseph, and I've probably preached on Joseph at least 50 times down through the years, and as a guest speaker in different places or either at Church on the Move. And so I started noticing years ago in the 39th chapter, speaking about Joseph, that the Hebrew emphasizes hand. And it kept appearing over and over again. And it's just redundant almost. It's like we're saying hand when we really didn't have to, but hand, hand, hand. And so I started counting, and I noticed there were 6 mentions of hand in Genesis chapter 39. I thought you did a great job the week before talking about the mentions of the name of the Lord, or Yahweh, in chapter 39. There are 8. Well, 8 is the number of Jesus. And so it was Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ, who was there with Joseph during all of his struggle. Wow. Joseph is the one most like the Messiah of all of the Old Testament characters. And
for sure,
the butler and the baker are the 2 thieves on the cross. One is released, and one is condemned.
Wow.
I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Right.
The types are just incredible. And so I started noticing that about the hand, and I thought there's a huge change here. And I've preached on it many, many times, but I started noticing that if you were to read Joseph in Genesis 37, you would say, all he does is talk.
Yeah, that was good.
And then when you go to Genesis 39, it's totally different. It's all he does is work.
Right.
And so he puts his hand on it, and you see the contrast. There was a big conversion.
And he doesn't put his hand on what he doesn't put his hand on, by the way, too, which being Potiphar's wife.
Right.
Which he's asking him to, and he doesn't, which is he knows where to put his hand and where not to.
That's right.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the command against adultery hadn't been given yet.
Right.
The law hadn't come until Sinai.
Right.
But spiritual law, and this is one of the things I said yesterday, spiritual law is articulated a lot, say, in Proverbs, but it was a law before Solomon articulated it. So it says the talk of the lips tends only to poverty, but in all labor there's profit. I reversed that actually, but that's what Solomon said. Talking only will always lead you to being broke. And that's what happened with Joseph. And he was gifted, and he was called, and he had the Holy Spirit. He was anointed, came from a great family, but he's still breaking spiritual laws. And so you want to be blessed, you have to learn to follow the spiritual laws. And that's what he did when he got into trouble.
So the law of the hand is about applying your. In some sense, I think maybe a great way to think of it is it's like asserting agency, and the same thing you get with the Lord when the Lord puts His hand on something or stretch forth your hand. It's a symbol of. And I've heard you talk about this before. Controlling something, to put your hand to it, is a sense of almost dominance in the best of ways. Maybe going back to Genesis 1, have dominion. It's the idea of put your hand to this garden. In essence, is what the Lord is saying to Adam and Eve. Do something with this. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And in Genesis 39, when speaking about Joseph, it also mentions the word serve. And so he was serving Potiphar, and he actually served the butler and the baker as we get into chapter 40. So serving was also tied to the hand. And it says clearly in the latter part of 39 that when Joseph was put into prison, whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it.
Wow.
So he had become a doer instead of a talker.
Wow.
And there's almost nothing. The only words that we have are when he is resisting Potiphar's wife. But but he is doing everything else with his hand. He's just staying busy, but that doesn't mean that there's not some kind of education taking place.
Right.
It wasn't just work. He was, and I tell people all the time, when you get into busy work and hard labor, you'll almost always have the thought, there has to be a better way to do this. And then you begin to think about how you're doing what you're doing. And so wisdom follows labor.
Wow.
And it always follows labor. It's like your ring finger and your pinky. You can't move one without the other one being affected. And that's what happens. When you begin to work with your hand, it pulls on wisdom and starts bringing wisdom into your life.
So much good stuff. This is what I love about this stuff, because it's life-changing. Like,
it is.
These are the things, these are the lessons that over the years and just working beside you, with you, and so forth, I just absorbed. So much of it now I'm realizing how much of it I absorbed, and I know just stuff in there because I saw this demonstrated and lived it in so many ways of just having to put your hand to things when you can't, and this is when you can't control, everything. And that's what you see with Joseph. He's in a spot where he can't control so much. And I think this is part of what I was trying to talk about with embracing your season is like, there are times I think, I know God specifically puts you in places that you're not going to be able to control. All you really can do is put your hand to something that's just right there. You're not going to be able to control kind of broader outcomes, change your role, change your spouse, even change your kids to some degree. But you're still tied to a situation that you can't hit the eject button from.
Right.
And there's so much to be learned, I think, in those seasons when if you'll, instead of trying to look for a way out, you learn how to press in, which is really what you're talking about with the concept of diligence. And I think we're living in a world where hitting the eject button, with no fault divorce, but there's so like breaking up with relationships. Heck, breaking up with a church. Well, we'll just leave. I don't have to stay here. When it gets hard, I can just eject. And there's something about Joseph being, I don't want to relate marriage to a prison, but there is something about being tied to someone in a way that you can't get away from that is really good for you.
Joseph could not have left physically, but he could have unplugged mentally.
Wow.
And so he didn't do that, and he stayed engaged. He put his heart into everything, and there is a mention of Joseph's authority. In fact, the ESV translates the word hand as authority. All that he has put under my authority. That's what he said to Potiphar's wife. But the Hebrew says hand. But in that instance, hand refers to authority. But the thing that people need to understand is Joseph seized responsibility. And that's what he reached for. And there was no one to fight him on that. Nobody said, no, you can't do that. No, he immediately reached out and said, I'll be responsible for this. I'll be responsible for that. He took responsibility all through Genesis 39. Well, it's another part of the law of the hand. If you take responsibility, you will be given authority. Now, this is where most people screw up. Most people grab for authority. What's my title?
Gosh.
What's my budget? Who do I get to boss around? You know, and that's how people think.
And they think they can't take responsibility until they have authority.
Right.
And I found that the best leaders are the ones that can do just the reverse of that.
You have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're already acting as though they're not in charge, but they're owners.
Yep.
As opposed, go ahead.
When you take authority nominally in name, I want authority here nominally.
Right.
But you don't take it functionally, people are going to resent you.
Right.
And that happens all the time, that we got people who are in authority that, yes, they've got the power, it's been delegated to them and so forth, but they really didn't take the responsibility that comes with it, so they have a nominal authority, but they don't have a functional authority. And so when you are responsible, even though you may not have the title, all of a sudden you're in charge of things, and that's what Potiphar did with Joseph, and that's what the keeper of the prison did with Joseph. Joseph had functional authority over both Potiphar's house and over... So and even to the point Potiphar's wife acknowledged
that's the truth,
that Joseph was the authority.
Yeah. So essentially what's happening is they're giving him a title that goes with what he's already in a sense doing.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe the idea that, oh man, this was maybe the biggest idea I heard was the idea of the hand being in the dark.
Right.
And you use the analogy, and I was laughing because this is my house too. Reaching over in the night to get a cup of water off your nightstand, and you dare not turn on the light lest you get kicked out of the bed. That Heather and I were laughing about that yesterday because Heather's a tyrant in our room. Like I have to be quiet. Everything But you were saying that the hand reaches. Talk about that in the dark. That was an insight, and that was a recent. That was like a this week insight for you.
This week I was thinking about this, and when you said what you said last weekend about the name of the Lord appears more in this chapter than in all the rest of the narrative. Well, it doesn't appear in any of the rest of the narrative. It doesn't. The name of God, El, appears, but not Yahweh. No. And so I'm thinking, okay, that's one I've missed. I've never seen that before. I thought, what else have I missed about all this? You know, and as I get older, that's the one thing I see. There's a whole lot that I don't know.
Wow.
And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And so I thought, let's take a look at every one of these scriptures. And I thought, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do. Well, I can identify with that because most of my ministry opportunities didn't come because they were in my heart. They came because I had to do it.
Yes.
And it was I was in a place of darkness and I had to take it. Came here to Tulsa in 78. By 79, I was about to lose my house. The church that I worked for had a real funky way of paying their ministers, and I got a designated gift. Basically, if people wanted to give something to the children's minister, they could. And so I went in the tank and almost lost everything. And so anyway, I got an invitation from Marilyn Hickey's church in Denver, Colorado. Got it sometime in the spring to do the kids' services at their camp meeting. And I really didn't want to do that. I really didn't. And I was going to do kids' services at a camp meeting here in Tulsa, but I really didn't want to go to Denver and for a much smaller camp meeting and so forth. I didn't want to do the kids' services there. But I had to. I needed the income. I didn't want to travel in the beginning, but I had to. I had to have the income. And so I was in a moment of desperation, and the money for me to make to pay my bills and just keep you guys fed,
Right.
it was incumbent upon me to take these meetings, and I had full permission to travel.
Right.
So anyway, I went out and did this meeting, and I had gotten a loan from the bank for a couple of grand and went up there and did this meeting and was able to pay off most of the loan with the meeting, and it turned our finances around. It was, but I saw something there. I thought, I would not have done this. This was not what I dreamed of with my heart that I would do when I would go, because I was pretty much stuck off with the kids in the basement of their church the whole time. I got very little exposure to the adult crowd, but I did what I did, and that was, and the Lord put it in my heart. He said, okay, you want to be known as an expert on children's ministry. You're going to have to show that you are. And you can't expect people to look to you as a man who can teach on how to minister to children if they don't know that you can. You're going to have to demonstrate it. So that's what my first step was. So now over time, as I began to do conferences and teach people how to work with kids, those children's ministry things dropped off. I got where I didn't do quite as many of them. I was able to let some of those go. I didn't really feel like that's where my effect was the greatest. But I had to do that in the beginning, and that was an example. I wasn't even going to be children's minister in the first place. I was called to be a pastor.
Well, that's the part that really interested me. Obviously, I know your story and have heard all that before, but the principle here is so huge because we're particularly now living in a time where especially young people feel as though I should only do things that connect with my dreams, with my heart,
absolutely,
with my purpose, that have some higher, deeper, more significant. Why would I take that job if it doesn't line up with my passions? Me and you being from a different generation and an older generation, some of it I think is generational, but I'm really grateful for it because I was asking a friend of mine this week when we were in Chicago. I was like, did you when I graduated high school, I just took the job that you put in front. I mean, I didn't think about when you said, Whit, come work at the church, you're going to be in the landscaping department. It didn't ever occur to me to ask myself, does that line up with my dreams? Even a lot of what I did, people ask me this regularly. I get it, did I dream of being a pastor? The answer is no. I had no clue I was going to do this. That wasn't anything. It wasn't even part of the sort of family discussions. It was not part of my upbringing. It was not understood that I was going to take over the quote unquote family business. Right. We just didn't talk about it. Heather says I married a graphic designer. It wasn't part of my plan, and yet following God where he led brought me to where I am. It's a very similar story with you. Opportunities are put in front of you, and you just put your hand to it. I don't think Joseph thought about running an Egyptian household. I don't think he ever thought about running a prison. What did he know? What training in so many ways did he have for running a prison? Yet he put his hand to what he had, and then God brought him to where. And that, to me, this is all connected to like my life verse, Hebrews 11:8, which is, by faith, Abraham, when called by God, went to a land he would later receive as his inheritance. He obeyed and went, though he did not know where he was going. To me, that's so much of the life of faith. And I think occasionally you bump into people who knew from an early age what they were going to do.
Right.
But I would say those people are rare.
They're very rare.
Rarely run into those folks.
Rare.
Most of the rest of us are kind of feeling our way through the dark. And that's what you were talking about with your hand. Is like your hand is needed when you're sort of feeling your way through the dark. But if you're just waiting for opportunities that mesh with your heart, you might not end up doing that much. So you should really take advantage of what God puts in your hand. And that's a lesson that I'm hoping my kids, especially, and I think this is a huge thing for like young people. It's like, man, because if you're sitting around waiting for, it often, what I found, and this is your story too, and I'd love for you to talk about this, the stuff that lines up with your heart often doesn't come till much later.
No.
Right. You don't get it in the beginning. In the beginning, it's hauling hay.
Right.
In the beginning, it's laying sod.
Right.
It's doing things you don't love. But when you put your hand to it, it's interesting. The dreams aren't fulfilled. The dreams that God gave Joseph aren't fulfilled till the end.
Right.
not at the beginning.
Right.
God doesn't say, well, let me just give you a taste of this. It's like the beginning is not great. That was such a huge principle. Anyway, the hand and the heart and the dark. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but that was so good.
We got a house when we first moved here. 6 months in, God blessed us with a little house, and we had some coworkers who were roughly our age, and we invited them over. We're so proud of our house, and we were showing them around, and it wasn't that much, And
this house on Pittsburgh,
yeah. And they had the audacity to tell us, "Well, this is not our dream house," and they described a house maybe like what Mom and I are living in right now.
Yeah.
And so, the house of...
They're holding out for it.
They're holding out for it.
Yeah.
And they said, we're not settling for anything less.
Yeah. And people think that it's faith...
Absolutely.
...to then hold out for those big, giant, crazy dreams.
Well, that's like walking up to a house that's got 10 steps to the porch, that it's up a hill, and you're saying, I am not settling for anything less than that porch. Well, here's how you get there.
Right.
Here's the step. Well, I'm not putting my foot on this because I am better than this.
Right.
And so that people make those decisions like that all the time. They refuse to see the value of steps, not realizing that God leads only in steps.
That's it. Yes.
Only in steps.
So then talk to someone 20, 25 years old because there really is this thing, Dad. I'm sure you're seeing it to some degree of kind of delayed adolescence, and for whatever reason it is young people it's taking longer to launch into things, and I think there's a variety of reasons, social and maybe even it has something to do with food and otherwise. But we won't try to dissect why. But what do you do? What would you say to someone in that season of life? Just advice about kind of moving forward, getting into where it is that God has them. They're not going to be there forever. What do they need to do in that season?
Well, the story of Joseph is not only a story of diligence, it's also a story of flexibility.
Wow.
And so I look back on my life, and somebody came to the ranch. One of the young pastors came, and he said, "You've had so many careers."
Yeah, you have,
and they're so different.
Right.
And they were. I was a kids minister and traveled all over America, and we couldn't go anywhere without kids knowing who we were,
right? Because
of the TV show, and that was a distinct phase of my life. But when I began to pastor the church, that didn't translate instantly, okay? In other words, we didn't have this thing with people saying, well, because you knocked it out of the park with kids, we know you're going to have a huge church.
In fact, it was a detriment to you.
It was a detriment to me, yeah. People thought, well, what does he know about pastoring adults and all of this? So I had to start again on a bottom step.
Wow.
But I had to learn to be flexible. And the other thing was I couldn't give up the kids ministry. I had bills. I had borrowed money for TV equipment. I had a payment to make. I still had to do gospel bills. So even when I launched Church on the Move, I was still having to film 2-3 gospel bill shows a month.
Wow.
And so I couldn't just let go of it all at once. And so there was a very gradual transition. For the first, over a year, Church on the Move didn't contribute a penny to my salary.
Right.
All we did is pay for the keyboard that we had to have on Sundays and the rent on the junior high school we were meeting in. It took a little while for the offerings to be enough to do anything substantial toward the ministry. Willie George Ministries was the thing that paid all the bills and kept us all going and all of that. And so we couldn't lay that down. Mm-hmm. And so there was this, we had to be flexible. And so I think one of the things that young people, in fact, even older people have trouble with it too, is they lose flexibility or never appreciate flexibility. Wow. And you have to be flexible. So this may not be the job I imagined, but I'm here. Let's see what we can do with this.
Yeah.
Let's make this work in somehow or another. And when you realize that no matter what it is you do, you're going to gain some kind of perspective that will serve you well later on, that this will be a part of your arsenal when you get into the main gig.
I think that principle, Dad, applies to a marriage. I think it applies to, in other words, it may not be what you expected. Often marriage isn't. You get in and you go, wait a minute, he's not who I thought he was exactly, or she's not, or this isn't working out the same way.
Well, why didn't you expect it? Because the movie showed you something different.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so you get in but I think that where we go off course is that we spend so much of our time trying to either correct reality to match up to our expectations,
right,
or lamenting or complaining or griping that reality is not our expectation. They whatever. Instead of just facing the situation that you're in and taking, I think there's a place for grief. I think there's a place for frustration. Give yourself a little space for that, but let's not park there. I imagine there was some time that Joseph had to grieve between, being sold into slavery by his brothers. I'm sure there was some moments of panic and some really dark nights of the soul in there. But somewhere between 37 and 39, he determines that he's going to do whatever he can with the situation that he has, and God blesses him in that. And I think that's a life principle that we all find ourselves in spots we would rather be in something different.
Well, from 37 to 39 is an 11-year period.
Wow.
So, and then there's 2 years from the first verse of Genesis 40 to when he actually interprets Pharaoh's dreams. That's 13 years. So he's 30 when he's exalted.
Wow.
Then it's still 9 more years before his brothers show up. So there are several different phases of this.
And so he that's one of the cool things about his story is that you get life working through all of these phases. You get so much going through there. That's incredible.
When most people think of Joseph's promotion at the hands of Pharaoh, they think about the interpreting of the dreams. And that isn't what got him the job as the Grand Vizier of Egypt. The dreams got him set free from prison, but that's all they would have done when you think about that. He tells Pharaoh, there's going to be 7 really, really good years and then 7 bad years, and that's why you dream 2 times, because it is from God. Joseph then presumes to offer Pharaoh advice that was not asked for.
Yes.
Now let Pharaoh, he steps in and begins to say, and this is pretty bold.
Yes, it is.
Seek out a man and appoint him to be over this. Wow. And he shares 4 things, and so one part of my message I thought was very, very important. What is it about Joseph? What did Pharaoh see? What did he see? And I see 4 things, and the 4 things that he saw in Joseph were things that were developed in Egypt. They were not present in him when he was at home.
Wow!
But it was the gift that God gave him at home that opened the door. But then it was what he had developed. And so a lot of people have this idea because God gives gifts to you and God inspires you, puts a dream in your heart and all of that. A lot of people think, I'll make it only on that. No, you won't. It is what Joseph developed in Egypt that enabled him to move forward and to go to an even higher place. And so all he would have had interpreting the dreams would have been his freedom. And then where's he going to go? And you brought that out last week. He can't go home and walks up over the hill. And we think about Joseph having all of this power, but power alone wasn't enough to convert the brothers. And this is going to come later in this series. When you see how he handled his brothers, it is the work of a master psychologist.
It is amazing.
It is just incredible.
And also, what's also interesting about that, and I look forward to getting into all this, Dad, but he's not bitter.
No.
And it's the only way he could do it.
Right.
It's interesting. Something in all of that period of time, he's been able to work through his own.
Yeah.
So you can tell he doesn't fully trust them.
Right.
But he's also not bitter against them.
He's not bitter, but there's a little play here because Simeon's the one he puts in the dungeon and holds him there the whole time the brothers go back. And he says, I want to see Benjamin, bring your younger brother. We don't know how long that was, maybe a period of several months, but Simeon is in the jail that whole time. Simeon is the hothead. Later on, when Jacob prophesies to the 12,
that's right,
he tells Simeon, your anger was unreal. And so undoubtedly, Simeon was the leader after Reuben.
Fascinating.
And so Reuben had no influence because of his sex sin, which is so totally totally accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, he lost all of his influence.
Yeah.
But Simeon was the de facto leader of the 10. And so Simeon sees Joseph coming and has him thrown in the pit. And then they're going to kill him, and that's what he's pushing for. And Levi follows along with Simeon wherever.
And these are the two that had went in after Dinah had been taken advantage of. They go in and wipe out the whole village.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And which they God had to intervene lest the Canaanites destroyed Jacob and all of his sons because there weren't that many. But God worked and put fear in the hearts of the Canaanites, keep them from messing with them. But Joseph has this little play going on with Simeon. Okay, we'll throw him in prison, but it did something. It broke this hold that Simeon had on the 10. And him being this angry guy and blowing up, no doubt everybody feared him. And Joseph cut him right down to size. So it wasn't bitterness, but at the same time, it was very necessary that Simeon have his fangs pulled. So he's the one that gets put in the dungeon.
That's a really cool insight. I hadn't thought of that one before. That's cool.
So let's talk about the 4 things right quick.
Okay.
All right. Joseph comes in without a beard. Now, that may sound like a very small thing, but it's huge. Everybody knows he's a Hebrew. Pharaoh knows he's a Hebrew. But when he comes in, he doesn't look like a Hebrew. So Joseph respected Egyptian culture. A beard was taboo in Egypt. It was disgraceful. And so, I don't know, we have taboos like that, I guess, in our culture. So anyway, he shaved the beard. His culture, you had a beard. Right. It was a disgrace not to have a beard back home. But he shaves the beard because now he's in Egypt. The other thing is he was able to communicate with Pharaoh very clearly. And we don't get it just in his speech with Pharaoh, but later when the brothers come, they can't tell he's
No, he has an interpreter.
And he works through an interpreter, but he's not speaking Egyptian with any kind of an accent.
Right.
And they would have picked that up. You can tell, I mean, you listen to me, you can tell. You can be Israeli and speak really good English, but I can still hear that Hebrew accent in your voice. I can hear that. It is a rare thing for someone to grow up with a particular language and switch over to a new language and not carry some kind of accent or there be some kind of brokenness in the speech. Joseph obviously didn't have that, so he learned the language and the culture, because if you're going to lead, you have to be able to do that. Then he talks about order and administration. You got to have someone over this whole thing, but he can't do it by himself. Let him have officers in all these cities, so he understands administration. Hebrews didn't understand administration. Even afterward, in the time of Moses, they did not understand administration, which is the reason why God had to engineer moving Moses from his own family into the house of the Pharaoh so he could learn how to administrator things.
And even then, his father-in-law had to come to him because he was basically burning himself out.
That's right.
So appointing leaders, that whole thing was kind of different, foreign to their culture.
Absolutely.
They were very much like a family clan.
Exactly. And God wanted, and in Egypt is where they became a nation.
Yep.
When they came across the Red Sea, they quit being a little family and they turned into a nation there. And so that had to happen, and Joseph saw that. And he saw the gift of administration was absolutely necessary. And then finally, people read over this and don't pay any attention to it, but he says, let's take the 5th part of the harvest for these 7 years. Now, that was a calculation because they had obviously, in that 11-year period where Joseph had been a slave, at some point there had been a bumper crop, and only had to be one. And Joseph, being in charge of the food supply, would have known what the effect of a bumper crop was on an average Egyptian household because he was in charge of buying the food.
Right.
And so he would have known how much the wheat prices dropped, and he would have seen all of that. And so he would have been able to calculate rates. So why didn't he say 40%? Let's put back 40%. Or it would stand to reason if you're going to have 7 good years and then 7 bad years, why not 50%?
Right, yeah.
But he understood that the 7 good would be so good that you could only you could get by with taking 20%.
Wow.
In that time frame. And Pharaoh hears this, and he says, this guy's an expert. He's throwing out hard numbers. And he turns to his followers, his court, and said, can we find such a man as this? And they're all looking, no, we can't.
Wow.
And they agreed. So just imagine what it would be like. It's all over again. Joseph having to prove himself in all of this with a bunch of jealous coworkers. They weren't jealous. They were blown away by him when he got in front of the Pharaoh and announced this plan. And they all agreed, this is the guy who can do it.
And I imagine, Potiphar had to be in amongst that group as well.
Yeah, he was. And don't you know, he was, breathing heavy when that all went down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the principle is, what's the principle that you're saying here?
Well, the principle is all of that stuff came to Joseph while he was in the prison. He didn't come with any of that from Canaan. And so the idea is the things that will put you on the top and keep you there are the things you're going to learn in tough times.
Wow.
And doing things you're not really meant to do or you really don't want to do, but those will be inevitably the things that you will fall back on more and more and more and more. And that's what happened. So
is this what you were talking about when you were referencing desperation?
Yes, that's it.
And being willing, things you were willing to do in your best decisions you talked about.
And I thought about that. I thought, okay, what are some of the major decisions that I made to make Church on the Move go? God spoke to me about doing Dry Gulch way back there. This is actually before we started Church on the Move.
Yeah.
And I had seen the land, I'd walked over it, and I said, okay, Lord, do we do this or not? And so Thanksgiving weekend, 1985, I got on my knees and started praying. And the Holy Spirit said, they're telling you it's going to take $2 million. It won't. It'll take $400,000 to open up phase 1. Just don't build it all at once. You'll never stop building, actually. When you raise money in 6-month commitments, because these are not your church people. These are other people's church members. When you travel, ask them for 50, 35, and 15. Those are the 3 levels of support you're going to ask for. And so I developed enough partnership that I could raise that money. Well, after about 8 months of being out on the road, I'd raised $300,000. And the last $100,000 I couldn't get, but I owed it. And so I was desperate to get that $100,000 to pay off our last contractor, and it wouldn't come. Now, it was a blessing that it wouldn't come because the contractor wasn't going to pay his subcontractors. And in my delay, there was a legal thing that popped up. I was going to get a loan, and I couldn't get the loan through because the guy who was selling me the land had lost a fight in court, and so the people who won the suit attached the land put a lien on it.
Right.
And so I had to get that lien removed. And in the process, while I'm dealing with these lawyers, I had no relationship with a lawyer in those days. And so the lawyers helped me to deal with this guy that I found out was not paying the subs. And so, but I didn't want to borrow the money because one of the things the Lord had said to me is don't borrow. And so I'm laying awake at night and I'm desperate. Gotta have this money. And it's not coming in now. And there's no anticipation about camp and getting it open because we got it open. We did. In 6 months, I got Dry Gulch open. And so now I go to people and say, hey, I need your help. And they're not too inclined to help because they think, well, he did it.
Open, right?
And so, what am I going to do? And he said, go borrow. I said, but you said I couldn't. He said, I told you that in the beginning because that's what you would have tried to do in the first place. But he said, you didn't know you could raise that much money. And so he said, now go borrow. And so when I borrowed, it opened up another whole bunch. But it was that desperation of looking to God. I became willing to do something because I had to do it. Church on the Move, getting it started, same thing. It was not an easy trip. It was difficult, and I had to be willing to do some things that I probably wouldn't have done had things not been so.
So you talk about, and I can relate. So you talk about two halves of that, kind of what desperation produces. Maybe there's three things I can see. One is you're willing to do things you wouldn't do and
That's right.
you wouldn't have done in the first place. Two, you're willing to stop doing things that you wouldn't have maybe been willing to stop doing. And that could apply to, honestly, making hard financial decisions, letting go of some relationships, or if you're an employer, that could look like laying off part of, when we had to go through that in 2019, and it was really hard, didn't want to do it. But I'm convinced, and a lot of what happened kind of with the transition, and long story short, is going through that squeeze financially that we were dealing with set us up really well for what was going to come in 2020.
Right.
And that wasn't fun, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't pleasant. But again, that whole season, I think we were set up for it because we were already in that place of desperation.
Think about the people on the receiving end of that. The people that you had to let go.
Right.
Far better, because the economy was booming in 19.
Yeah.
And far better for them to get out and to have to find their place in 2019 as opposed to having to in the middle of the pandemic.
Sure.
They had already landed on their feet somewhere in 2020, and so even for them, it was a blessing in disguise.
So things you start doing that you wouldn't have been willing to do, things you stop doing or let go of that you wouldn't have necessarily been willing to, and then thirdly, and you keep talking about this, but it does drive you into your relationship with the Lord. I mean, you really find yourself on your knees in a period of desperation. You're praying a lot more because you're having to turn to the Lord.
You examine your motives.
Yeah, you do. It produces something like that in you.
Well, desperation is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And we think of it as being, how did I get here? Oh no, this is awful. But it's amazing how many times great people in the Scriptures found themselves in a place of desperation, and that was the moment of great change. That's why Jacob wrestled with God.
Yeah.
He was desperate because he heard Esau was coming.
Yeah.
And he's wrestling with God, and that's when God gives him the new name Israel. And changes his essential nature.
I think a lesson I had learned from watching you live that way for so long, Dad, and that helped me in 2020 was that when you find yourself in a place of desperation, didn't have the language exactly to articulate it, but there's always an opportunity. There's something you can do in those periods, those seasons. There's something to be done, rather than just, gosh. And I think the approach that shaped and changed us at Church on the Move was we didn't spend all of our time in 2020 focusing on how can we just get back?
Yeah.
How do we get back? You know what the gift was for me is I didn't want to go back.
Yeah.
Because where we were 2019, 2018, 2017, we needed some change, and the church needed to go through some stuff. And so I was in no hurry to try to get back to where we were. I know a lot of guys, that was their focus because they were in a good spot. It's like, how do we get back to the good times? We weren't interested in that. I wasn't interested in that. I was looking for what way forward is there. And I do think that's a lesson in desperation, is looking for the opportunity. You may not, that's again where Joseph was at. There's what's there to go back to? I don't know that I can go back. You can't always go back, but looking for opportunity in the midst of all that.
Another thing desperation's pretty good at is knocking pride right out of you.
Yes, it is.
and you'll find yourself having to do some things that are a little bit embarrassing.
Yes, you will.
I remember I had a desperate period in 1993, and I had to lay off 21 people. Mm-hmm. And there were other churches in the city requesting prayer for us and publicly, let's pray for Willie George and Church on the Move. They're having to
really struggling right now.
Yeah. And they were doing this publicly and kind of, gleeful about the whole thing. And it got me. But I thought, you know what? I'm not going to let that eat on me. I can't. I'm glad we had to do it. I'm glad we could have done it. And you have to reach a point where you're willing to do this. That became one of the determinant factors in us getting a relationship with our bank that we have today. They came to me and they said, we've watched you guys, and one of the things that we like about you is that if something isn't working,
You're not afraid to.
You're not afraid to let it go. Mm-hmm. And so many church leaders are so intent on saving face
because it's and
they will ruin themselves.
So
they will ruin themselves financially to keep up an appearance.
Yeah. Faith is holding on to all of that, no matter if the ship's going down. Just keep holding on and keep believing. But you were never that guy.
No.
Wow. Yeah, that's so true. That made me. Yeah. So I was thinking, and you'll know the verse because I know you have this one memorized. What is it, Peter? 1 Peter. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God.
That He may exalt you.
Exactly, it's that hand. So here's the hand, but this time it's God's hand, and you're having to humble yourself, which will result in a loss of pride, if you're willing to do it. But there's exaltation that comes on the other side of that.
The following verses are associated with that. Be sober. Think clearly. Be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour.
Yeah.
Who can he devour? Anybody that's got pride. And so he's going to tear you up if you don't get rid of your pride.
Wow.
If when you humble yourself, you're inoculating yourself from the attack of the enemy.
Dad, this has been awesome. I love the story of Joseph because you get the story of you get this type of Christ, and like you said, maybe better than anyone else. But also, there may be more wisdom packed into Joseph's story than maybe any other Old Testament character, at least for my money. I think there's so many, the life lessons that come out of his story are phenomenal.
Prophetically, I'll say one more thing.
Okay.
Genesis could stop with Jacob coming into the land because he's got the name Israel. He's got the 12 sons. He's back in Canaan. But he still hasn't arrived. And we're only at Genesis chapter 36.
Right.
And so when we get to Genesis 37, fully, we've got a quarter of the book left. Then Joseph is not considered one of the patriarchs. You don't hear Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. You don't hear that. It's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But there's a 360-year clock that starts with the birth of Abraham that does not end until the death of Joseph. Now, in my mind, 360 is a full circle. That's we're not thinking about a year here. We're thinking about a circle with 360 degrees. So it's one full loop. And so the loop isn't completed till the story of Joseph is factored in. But he's not Israel. He comes out of Israel, but he's not Israel. So he is the Messiah. So even though God did great work in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, without the Messiah, and that's who Joseph is.
And he's this bridge to a whole other culture, a whole other people, really the rest of the world.
And that's what Egypt represents.
That's exactly what
Egypt represents the world, and that was God's purpose, was to take what was in Israel and expose it to the world. So
that's fascinating.
And this is what gave God the prerogative of judging Egypt under Moses. Because he saved
Joseph
Egypt.
Had been sent.
That's right. So I saved you. For me to come in here as a stranger without any relationship with you and just judge you guys, but see, God had a right because he had saved them.
Wow.
And so there would not have been an Egypt had it not been for the Hebrews.
That's really cool. So betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, becomes their savior and the savior of the world.
And they don't recognize him. He's attached to bread. Pharaoh, the name Pharaoh gives him when the Egyptian language is associated with bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's just endless.
This has been really awesome. Dad, thanks for joining us
on
the podcast today. It's been really, really beautiful discussion.
Thank you, sir.